My name is Claire Harris, well, soon to be Clare Evans again, a name I'm reclaiming like a long-lost piece of my own soul, a name that tastes like freedom and strength on my tongue. For 12 agonizingly long years, I was a wife, a partner, and for the last 10 of those, a dedicated third-grade teacher at Northwood Elementary. It's a place where I poured every ounce of my heart into nurturing young minds, a sanctuary where the innocent creativity of children felt like a balm to the subtle wounds inflicted elsewhere. It was there, amidst the construction paper and tempera paints, against the silent, insidious odds I increasingly felt were stacked against me in the gilded cage of my own home, that I eventually became head of elementary curriculum, a success. I fought for tooth and nail a quiet victory I earned in the shadows of a crumbling marriage. The moment I found out what he really thought of me after 12 years of shared dreams that now felt like elaborate illusions and whispered promises that had curdled into lies wasn't when I found the crimson smear of another woman's lipstick on his ridiculously expensive Turnbull and Asser shirt collar. A careless, arrogant, almost contemptuous mistake. No, the true gut-wrenching, soul-cleaving revelation came much later under the oppressively harsh glare of our dining room chandelier, a fixture Jackson had chosen, proclaiming it a statement piece. It was certainly making a statement now, illuminating a battlefield where we'd once hosted seemingly happy dinner parties filled with laughter that now echoed with a hollow, mocking timbre. It was when Jackson, my husband, the man whose hand I'd held through genuine sickness and celebrated successes, the man I'd vowed to love, till death do us part, slid a thick stack of papers across the polished, cold mahogany, a cruel, unfamiliar, predatory smile playing on his lips. "Sign them, Claire," he'd said, his voice a low, chilling monotone, utterly devoid of any warmth I once foolishly believed I knew. "You're getting nothing. Absolutely nothing. Not a dime, not a chair, not a memory." But what Jackson, in his meticulously calculated cruelty and breathtaking arrogance, didn't know, couldn't possibly fathom, was that there were multiple truths, layers upon layers of them, about to be revealed that night. Truths I had carefully, painfully, almost obsessively gathered over months of sleepless nights, punctuated by the frantic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall and tear-stained pillows I'd hidden from his sight. Truths that would unravel not just his meticulously crafted deception, but the entire glittering, rotten facade of our perfect Austin marriage. A facade he had so carefully curated for the world. My hands were shaking then, not from fear of his empty threats, but from the cold, hard, diamond-sharp resolve that had taken root in the desolate ruins of my trust, a resolve fertilized by his contempt. For a long, long time I'd felt invisible, a ghost in my own life, both in my marriage and, if I'm brutally honest with myself, in other quiet, shadowed corners of my life, where my voice seemed to fade into the background noise dismissed as easily as a soft breeze. He of all people, the man who prided himself on his financial acumen and strategic thinking, should have known that quiet didn't mean oblivious or stupid. It meant observant. It meant I was listening, watching, learning. It meant I was preparing. I always believed I was an open book, perhaps too much, so my emotions often worn too close to the surface, easily read. Claire, the ever-reliable, the one who remembered everyone's birthdays and anniversaries with thoughtful, often homemade gifts, the one who smoothed over family awkwardnesses with a gentle, mediating word or a well-timed, calming cup of Earl Grey tea. Growing up in a bustling, often chaotic household just outside San Antonio, I wasn't the star of my family. I was the steady, quiet planet in a solar system that revolved around brighter, more demanding, often more volatile, celestial bodies. My older sister Deirdre, 2 years my senior, was the designated firework. Brilliant, beautiful, explosive, and demanding every single watt of available attention. Her life was a series of grand pronouncements, dramatic entrances, and equally dramatic exits. My parents, David and Susan Evans, good people at heart but perpetually overwhelmed, were often too busy managing Deirdre's latest romantic entanglement. her newest artistic endeavor, which rarely lasted more than a few months, or celebrating her latest flamboyant, if fleeting achievement, to notice my smaller, quieter, more consistent successes. It wasn't malicious. I truly don't think so. It was just the established familial weather pattern. Deirdre was the squeaky wheel, and she got all the grease. I learned early, perhaps around the age of 7, when my meticulously constructed science fair volcano, complete with historically accurate Pompeii diorama, was overshadowed by Deirdre's impromptu interpretive dance about the plight of the monarch butterfly, that self-sufficiency was my only true ally. I learned to find my validation in the neat rows of my color-coded notes, the satisfying click of a well-researched fact falling into place, the perfect execution of a complex lesson plan, the quiet, almost meditative hum of a well-organized life. This perhaps was my first deeply ingrained lesson in being overlooked, a lesson Jackson would unwittingly and fatally bank on years later. For example, when I won the county spelling bee in 6th grade, a rather large silver cup accompanying the honor, my parents were unfortunately an hour late to the ceremony because Deirdre had a crisis involving a misplaced pair of designer jeans she simply had to wear to a concert that night. They arrived, flustered, offered a quick, "Well done, sweetie," and then spent the car ride home discussing how to best placate Deirdre. The silver cup sat on my dresser, a testament to an achievement witnessed by strangers, but largely uncelebrated by those who mattered most. Another time in high school, I was awarded a scholarship for a summer writing program based on a portfolio of short stories I'd poured my heart into. Deirdre, that same week, decided to dye her hair electric blue, resulting in a minor chemical burn and a major family drama that consumed all available emotional energy for days. My acceptance letter, full of praise for my unique voice and mature insight, felt almost like a secret I had to keep. My quiet talent for observation and articulation, which would later serve me so well, was simply background noise. Academically, I was always a strong student, but my straight A's were accepted as Clare, being Clare expected, and therefore unremarkable. Deirdre's C's and occasional B's, however, were cause for parental sighs of relief and pronouncements of, "She's really trying so hard, bless her." My parents, David, an engineer whose mind thrived on logic but often faltered in the face of emotional complexities, and Susan, a former nurse whose compassion was vast but often unevenly distributed, seemed to operate under the assumption that I, the quiet one, was fine, and therefore required less tending. Deirdre, with her dramatic flair, always seemed on the verge of some catastrophe, thus demanding constant vigilance and support. I don't blame them entirely. Their own parents, my grandparents, were from a generation that valued stoicism and discouraged emotional displays. My mother often told me stories of her own mother, a stern woman who believed children should be seen and not heard, making Susan perhaps overcompensate with her more flamboyant child. I met Jackson Harris during my final exhausting year of teachers college at UT Austin. He was already a rising star in the finance world, a recent MBA graduate working for a prestigious downtown firm. He was undeniably charismatic, driven with a quick wit and a smile that could, and often did, melt glaciers, or at least my carefully constructed reserve. He pursued me with a flattering intensity. He made me feel seen, truly seen, for what felt like the first time in my life. He'd listen, or so I thought at the time, his dark eyes fixed on mine as I spoke about my dreams of innovative teaching methods, my burgeoning passion for child psychology, my desire to make a real difference. He'd ask follow-up questions, remember small details. It was intoxicating. Our early years were a dizzying whirlwind of building a life, the charming suburban house in a leafy Austin neighborhood with its magnificent sprawling oak in the backyard. The one I'd fall in love with instantly, his steady, relentless climb up the corporate ladder to CFO, my own deep contentment and sense of purpose in my 3rd grade classroom at Northwood Elementary. We seemed like the golden couple. Jackson was an only child, and his mother, Margaret Harris, doted on him with an almost suffocating intensity. Margaret was a presence. always perfectly coiffed, her silver hair styled in an immaculate helmet, impeccably dressed in expensive, understated designer labels, with an opinion on everything from my choice of curtains. A little too cheerful. Don't you think, dear, to the way I loaded the dishwasher? The knives should always point down Claire for safety. One would think that's common sense. She wasn't overtly unkind, not usually, not in a way you could easily call out, but there was always a subtle undercurrent, a faint chilling air of her brilliant, exceptional son having married someone nice, serviceable. Competent, perhaps, in her little sphere, but not quite the power wife she might have envisioned for her brilliant Jackson. She'd often say things like, "It's wonderful that you have your little teaching career, Claire. It must keep you busy and give you something to talk about while Jackson is out conquering the world." The condescension was a faint cloying perfume almost undetectable, unless you lived with it day in and day out, its subtle poison seeping into the pores of your confidence. I remember one Christmas, she gifted me a very expensive, very dull beige cashmere cardigan, remarking, "This will be so practical for you, dear. It won't show the dirt." Jackson had just gifted her a diamond tennis bracelet. The contrast was not lost on me. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, like a tide subtly eroding a shoreline, the dynamic in our marriage began to mirror those early family patterns of my childhood. My successes, like being nominated for Teacher of the Year in my district after only 5 years at Northwood, an honor I was incredibly proud of, were met with a distracted, "That's great, honey. Did you pick up my dry cleaning?" usually followed by an exhaustive, self-congratulatory monologue about his latest boardroom battle or a potential multi-million-dollar merger he was spearheading. When I redesigned the entire elementary school's reading program, a Herculean project that took months of unpaid overtime, late nights, fueled by lukewarm coffee, and resulted in a significant, measurable improvement in literacy scores across all grades, he nodded vaguely when I tried to explain the pedagogical principles behind it, said, "Sounds good. Impressive stuff," then immediately asked if his gray Brioni suit had come back from the special cleaners he insisted on using. His promotions, his bonuses, the closing of a big deal. These were monumental, earth-shattering events celebrated with ostentatiously expensive dinners at Uchi, or Jeffrey's events I meticulously planned right down to ensuring his favorite Napa Cabernet was decanted an hour before our arrival. I was the stage manager for his triumphs, an invisible hand ensuring the spotlight always found him. I remember once, about 5 years into our marriage, full of hope and a naive belief in his partnership, I tentatively brought up the idea of pursuing my master's in educational leadership. I had visions of curriculum development on a larger scale, of impacting education beyond my single classroom. Jackson's response was lukewarm, delivered while scrolling through stock prices on his phone. "Are you sure, Claire? That's a lot of time and money, isn't it? My career is really demanding right now. We need stability, not more upheaval. And frankly, is it really going to make much difference to your salary?" This from a man who'd just bought a vintage cherry red Porsche 911 as an investment. An investment he mostly just polished in the garage, and whose golf club membership at the ultra-exclusive Barton Creek Country Club cost more annually than my entire proposed master's program. The Porsche sat in the garage, a gleaming symbol of his priorities, mostly admired and rarely driven, while my ambition sat on a metaphorical shelf, gathering dust, another quiet sacrifice laid at the altar of his ascent. He'd forget our anniversary one year, our 7th, the copper and wool anniversary, for which I'd knitted him a rather lovely, if I say so myself, cashmere wool blend scarf. A genuine oversight, he claimed his apology laced with just the right amount of rueful charm due to a hellacious week at work, sweetheart, you wouldn't believe. I found a receipt a week later tucked into a golf magazine for a lavish lunch at a downtown steakhouse for two dated on our anniversary. A client meeting he'd later mumble when I gently, always too gently, inquired. The client's initials on the itemized bill, clearly visible, were SM. I didn't recognize them at the time, but they would resurface later with sickening clarity. My birthday often coincided with his quarterly financial reports, meaning a hurried, distracted dinner at home or a postponed celebration that sometimes never materialized. Yet his golf weekends with his buddies, particularly his new, increasingly influential confidant Patrick, were sacrosanct, meticulously scheduled, months in advance, and never, ever missed or compromised. My quiet nature, my innate tendency to avoid confrontation, my inherent, almost desperate desire for peace and harmony. These traits Jackson once claimed to love to find soothing and centering, he began to mistake for weakness, for passivity, for a lack of intellectual rigor. My meticulous organization, the skills that kept our home running like a Swiss watch, our joint finances, the small part I had oversight of in perfect order and allowed me to juggle a demanding career with household management, was taken for granted, like the electricity or the running water, noticed only if it failed. He didn't see the keen, analytical mind behind the calm, accommodating demeanor, the strategic thinking honed by years of deciphering children's complex needs and navigating the labyrinthine politics of school district bureaucracy. He saw a comfortable, predictable, slightly boring wife. He saw someone who would never, ever rock the boat, no matter how turbulent the waters became. He couldn't have been more profoundly, catastrophically wrong. The frustration, the slow, corrosive burn of being consistently undervalued, unseen, and unheard was laying a foundation not of brittle bitterness that would shatter under pressure, but of an unyielding, silent, deeply rooted resolve. I was connecting dots he didn't even know were on the page, dots that were beginning to form a very ugly picture. The years unspooled, each one a thread in a tapestry, woven with a repeating pattern, my hopes being quietly, almost casually shelved, while Jackson's ambitions took glorious, unfettered center stage. It wasn't one grand, dramatic, opera-worthy betrayal that defined this era of our marriage, but 1,000 tiny, insidious paper cuts, each one stinging with a fresh pang of dismissal, each one a microscopic tear in the fabric of my self-worth, each one a chilling reminder of my diminishing presence in his increasingly self-absorbed life. The pattern became so ingrained, so predictable, that a weary part of me almost grew numb to it, accepting it as the drab, unchangeable wallpaper of our marriage. "This is just how it is," a defeated little voice would whisper. "This is Jackson." My 10th anniversary as a teacher at Northwood Elementary was a significant milestone for me personally and professionally. I'd poured a decade of my life, my energy, my very essence into those children, into that vibrant school community. I felt I genuinely made a difference. I'd hinted about it to Jackson for weeks, not expecting a parade, but hoping for perhaps a small, intimate dinner, a simple, heartfelt acknowledgement of my dedication. The day arrived a Tuesday. I came home from school laden with handmade cards from my students and a small bouquet from my principal. Jackson was gone. A note on the kitchen counter scribbled on the back of an envelope, "Emergency trip to Dallas with the team. Huge deal. Back late tomorrow. Jay." He called even later that night, well past midnight, his voice tinny and distant over the poor connection, full of apologies that sounded hollow and well-rehearsed. "So sorry, babe. This deal is make or break for the quarter. We'll celebrate properly when I get back, promise." We never did. A few days later, I was scrolling through social media when I saw pictures posted by a junior colleague of his, a young, eager analyst. The emergency team trip was in fact a lavish team-building event at a very upscale Dallas resort, complete with a golf tournament and a gala dinner. Jackson was in several photos laughing uproariously, a glass of champagne in his hand, looking anything but stressed or overworked. My 10th anniversary was just another casualty of his important life. I ate a slice of leftover pizza alone that night, the children's cards my only company, a cold knot of disappointment tightening in my stomach. Then there was the small article I'd written, a piece I was immensely proud of. After the demonstrable success of the new reading program I'd spearheaded, my supportive principal, Mrs. Albright, had encouraged me to write about my methodology and experiences. After countless evenings refining it, it was published in a respected regional education journal. Nothing that would set the academic world on fire, but to me it was a significant personal and professional achievement. I'd bought an extra copy, circled my name in the contributors list, and left it on his bedside table with a hopeful note. Days later, it was still there, untouched, a silent rebuke, the optimistic bookmark I'd placed on page 1, unmoved. When I finally tentatively asked if he'd had a chance to look at it, he'd picked it up, glanced at the cover with a cursory air, and said, "Oh, right. This thing. Looks educational. Heavy stuff. Good job, Claire." Then he'd immediately launched into a lengthy complaint about a dip in the stock market and how it was affecting his portfolio. My internal monologue screamed, "Is that it? Is that all you see? Just educational? Did you even read the title? Do you have any idea how much this meant to me?" But outwardly, I just nodded, a familiar, dull, throbbing ache settling in my chest, the words of protest dying on my lips yet again. It was easier to say nothing. His world, however, was always painted in vibrant, dramatic technicolor. Every achievement a blockbuster premiere. When he was officially named Chief Financial Officer, the celebration, orchestrated largely by me, lasted nearly a week. There was the lavish cocktail party he threw for his executive team and key clients at our home, for which I planned the menu, hired the caterers, selected the wines, arranged the flowers, and then played the gracious, smiling, invisible hostess. There was the new, obscenely expensive Patek Philippe watch he bought himself. A CFO needs to look the part, Claire. It's about projecting success. There were the endless self-congratulatory recountings of his strategic genius, his bold moves, his tireless work ethic to anyone who would listen, especially his adoring mother, Margaret. She would beam her eyes, shining with maternal pride, patting his arm affectionately. "That's my boy. I always knew you were destined for truly great things, Jackson. You work so incredibly hard, darling. You deserve every single success." She then turned to me, a tight, almost pitying smile on her perfectly lipsticked lips. "You must be so incredibly proud, Claire. It's so important for a wife to be supportive and understanding when her husband has such a demanding, important, world-changing career." The implication, as always, was crystal clear. My career was a quaint, harmless pastime. His was akin to nation-building. My role was to applaud from the sidelines. I remember one particularly painful Sunday dinner at Margaret's impeccably appointed museum-like home. Jackson was holding court, recounting for at least the third time that evening a minor triumph over a rival company involving a slightly better-than-expected quarterly earnings report. He made it sound like he'd single-handedly saved the global economy. I just that Friday had received a glowing annual review from the school superintendent with a special commendation for my leadership in mentoring new teachers and for the sustained success of my reading program. It came with a small, but for me, significant raise. I tried to share my news during a rare lull in Jackson's monologue. "That's lovely, dear," Margaret had said, her eyes flicking towards me for a nanosecond before returning laser-focused to her son. She didn't miss a beat in refilling Jackson's wineglass with the expensive Bordeaux he favored. "But Jackson, darling, do tell me more about this new acquisition strategy you mentioned. It sounds utterly fascinating and so complex." I felt myself shrink, the words of my small triumph dying on my tongue, tasting like ash. It was like I was speaking a language only I could understand my achievements, written in invisible ink. My internal monologue was a bitter whisper. Why do I even bother? They don't care. He doesn't care. My best friend, Natalie Foster, was my lifeline, my sanity keeper during these increasingly isolating years. We'd met in a prenatal yoga class years ago. I'd suffered a miscarriage shortly after a quiet grief. Jackson had been characteristically awkward and dismissive about "These things happen, Claire. We can try again when work settles down." But my friendship with Natalie had blossomed from that shared gentle space. Her sharp wit, fierce intelligence, and no-nonsense, tell-it-like-it-is attitude were a refreshing, bracing antidote to the subtle, suffocating dismissals I faced at home. Initially still trying to maintain the facade of a happy marriage, even to my closest friend, I'd presented her vaguely as my friend. The financial advisor, a small protective shield I'd unconsciously put up around the true painful nature of our deepening conversations about my marriage. I'd confide in her over endless cups of strong coffee at a little independent cafe on South Congress, my voice often trembling, laden with unshed tears as I recounted the latest slight, the most recent example of Jackson's casual disregard, the ever-widening icy chasm between us. "He just doesn't see me anymore, Nat," I'd said one particularly bleak afternoon, the Austin sun feeling like a mockery outside the cafe window. Tears welled hot and shameful. "It's like I'm part of the furniture, useful, functional, but utterly unremarkable. Something he just expects to be there, polished and in its place." Natalie, ever perceptive, her dark eyes missing nothing, would listen patiently, letting me pour it all out without interruption. Then, her gaze unwavering, she'd set her voice firm but kind. "Clare furniture can be dusted, ignored, and eventually replaced. Don't ever let him or anyone make you feel replaceable. More importantly, what are you going to do about it? Are you going to keep letting him dim your light?" Her words, initially unsettling, almost accusatory, began to plant a tiny, hesitant seed in the barren ground of my despair. What was I going to do? For too long, far too long, I had passively accepted the pattern, hoping against hope that it would magically change, praying that Jackson would one day wake up, look at me with the eyes he'd had when we first met, and see the woman he was slowly, methodically losing. The most recent and by far the most jarring, visceral disappointment, the one that finally shattered my passivity, was the lipstick. It wasn't just any lipstick. It was a shade I'd never worn in my life, a bold, overtly sexual, confident crimson smeared carelessly, almost defiantly on the inside collar of one of his custom-made monogrammed work shirts. It was tucked deep in the recesses of the laundry hamper, as if to hide it, but not well enough a testament to his sloppiness, or more likely his supreme arrogance. It was a Tuesday. He'd come home exceptionally late, well after I'd gone to bed, smelling faintly but unmistakably of a heavy floral perfume that wasn't mine, claiming a critical networking dinner had run over. The sight of that crimson stain stark against the pristine white Egyptian cotton was a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. It wasn't just a betrayal of our marriage vows. It was a brutal, undeniable confirmation of every gnawing doubt, every whispered fear, every sick suspicion I diligently, desperately pushed down for years. The sadness that engulfed me was immense, a tidal wave of grief that threatened to drown me in its cold, dark depths. But beneath the sorrow, something else began to stir, something I hadn't felt in a very long time. A cold, hard, crystallizing anger. The pattern wasn't just about being overlooked or dismissed anymore. It was about active, calculated, contemptuous deceit. And that I realized, with a sudden, chilling clarity that cut through the fog of my pain, was something I could no longer just absorb, rationalize, or forgive. The quiet, accommodating peace at any price. Claire was beginning to recede, and in her place, a woman I barely recognized. A woman with ice in her veins and fire in her eyes was starting to take meticulous, indelible notes. The discovery of that vivid, damning lipstick stain wasn't an end. It was a horrifying, irrevocable beginning. It was the single loose thread that, once pulled with trembling fingers, began to unravel the entire elaborate, rotten tapestry of my marriage, revealing a pattern of deceit and manipulation far more intricate and cold-blooded than I could have ever, in my most cynical moments, imagined. My initial shock, the feeling of the floor dropping out from under me, morphed with alarming speed into a chilling alertness, a hyper-awareness of every nuance in Jackson's behavior, every unexplained late night, every hushed, furtive phone call he took in another room, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur, if I entered. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely hold the shirt steady. I confronted him the next morning before he left for work, the offending garment clutched in my fist like irrefutable blood-stained evidence. "Jackson, what is this?" My voice was quiet dangerously, so a low hum that barely concealed the seismic tremor beneath. He had the audacity to feign surprise, his eyes widening in mock innocence, then annoyance. "Oh, for God's sake, Claire, don't be ridiculous. Seriously, you're going to start this again." He ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair. It must have been from that awful client appreciation event last week, packed in like sardines. You know how those things are, people bumping into each other, air kisses flying. Probably some overenthusiastic marketing type. He even attempted a dismissive little laugh, but his eyes, those dark, unreadable eyes, wouldn't meet mine. The excuse was so flimsy, so patently false, so utterly insulting to my intelligence, it was like a second deliberate slap in the face. His casual, almost bored dismissal of my evident pain was the first real, visible crack in my carefully maintained composure. He doesn't even respect me enough to come up with a believable lie I thought a cold fury beginning to solidify in my gut. I'd always managed our household budget meticulously, stretching my teacher's salary to cover groceries, utilities, and my own modest personal expenses. Jackson, with his CFO income, handled our larger investments, retirement accounts, and his own significant discretionary spending. Suddenly, with my senses now on high alert, I started noticing things I'd previously dismissed or hadn't had access to. Small, then, larger, unexplained withdrawals from our joint savings account, an account he rarely touched, ostensibly our rainy day fund. When I'd found an old statement, I cross-referenced it with newer ones I managed to glimpse. Thousands were missing over several months. Then, a new credit card statement bearing the logo of a bank we'd never used addressed to him was hastily shoved into his briefcase one morning. I only caught a glimpse of the name, Platinum Executive Rewards, before he snapped the briefcase shut. When I cautiously, gently asked about a particular large withdrawal from the joint savings, citing a need to budget for a potential new roof, he'd snapped, his voice sharp with irritation. "It's for an investment, Claire. Complex financial instruments, derivatives. You wouldn't understand the intricacies. Just trust me, I know what I'm doing." The condescension was familiar, a bitter, well-worn cloak, but now it felt laced with something more sinister, more deliberate. Trust him. The irony was a burning, acrid pill on my tongue. He was siphoning off our future, and I was supposed to just trust him. His late nights at the office became more frequent, his excuses more elaborate and less plausible. Emergency board meetings that ran until midnight, critical strategy sessions that couldn't be postponed, entertaining international clients who only had one night in Austin. He was also increasingly critical of me finding fault with the meals I cooked. A bit bland, isn't it, Claire, the way I kept the house? Are these cushions always this lopsided? Even my perceived lack of ambition. Don't you ever want more than just gouging Claire? It was classic gaslighting, making me the problem. Then the digital breadcrumbs began to appear, carelessly dropped in his arrogance. A careless tag on a social media photo from a supposed boys' golf trip to Pebble Beach showed him at a very expensive, very romantic-looking cliffside restaurant, not with his usual balding, middle-aged golf buddies, but with a striking, much younger woman with dark, glossy hair, laughing intimately, her hand resting possessively on his arm. Her name, according to the tag by one of his newer, younger, sycophantic colleagues who clearly hadn't gotten the memo about discretion, was Sophia Miller. A quick, discreet, heart-pounding search on LinkedIn revealed her to be an ambitious, recently promoted senior vice president of marketing at a rival financial firm, one that had recently been in talks for a strategic alliance with Jackson's company. Suddenly, the SM initials on that old steakhouse receipt from our forgotten anniversary clicked into place with horrifying, nauseating clarity. This wasn't new. This wasn't a recent indiscretion. This was established. This was a pattern. This was a whole other life. My heart didn't just break. It shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. When I hinted at my burgeoning suspicions, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to remain calm, referencing his increased secrecy, the unexplained expenses, and the name Sophia Miller, he exploded. It was a calculated, theatrical rage designed to intimidate and silence. "You're being paranoid, Claire." Unbelievably, insanely paranoid and jealous. Sophia is a brilliant new executive we are trying to poach for our team. We had one dinner with a group to discuss the offer. "Are you going to accuse me of having an affair with every single woman I work with, or try to recruit? My God, this is suffocating. Maybe you should focus on making our home life less stressful and more supportive. Instead of inventing these ridiculous, baseless dramas, he twisted everything expertly, turning my valid concerns into evidence of my instability, making me question my own sanity, my own perceptions. It was a masterful, cruel performance. Around this time, he also started mentioning his golf buddy, Patrick Donovan, more and more frequently, almost as a counterpoint to my suspicions. Patrick gave me some great advice on a complex tax loophole, saved us a bundle. Or Patrick knows a guy who can sort out any kind of legal paperwork cheap and quick, no fuss. A vague, creeping unease settled around this mysterious Patrick, who seemed to be Jackson's new guru for everything, especially things that sounded suspiciously shady. Patrick Jackson would say with a knowing wink, was a problem solver, a man who gets things done. The final undeniable wave crashed with the subtlety of a tsunami when I was searching for a misplaced insurance card in Jackson's usually meticulously organized day planner. He'd become strangely careless lately. Another sign of his distraction or arrogance. Tucked into a side pocket, I found a crisp, expensive-looking business card, Ethan Parker and Associates, Family Law Specialists. Not just any law firm, but one of the most prominent, most aggressive, and most expensive divorce attorney firms in Austin. My blood ran cold, a glacial wave washing over me, leaving me numb and shaking. He wasn't just cheating. He wasn't just siphoning off funds. He was actively planning to leave me, and if his earlier cruel comment from that night now echoed with chilling prescience, "You're getting nothing." He was planning to leave me destitute, to erase me from his life as thoroughly and clinically as a surgeon excising a tumor. My emotional breaking point wasn't a dramatic collapse, no shattering of teacups or screaming recriminations. It was a moment of terrifying, icy, diamond-hard clarity. The man I married was either long gone, a phantom of my own hopeful imagination, or had been a carefully constructed, elaborate illusion all along. The grief was still there, a hollow, aching void in my chest, where my heart used to be, but it was now overlaid, encased in a layer of steely, protective, righteous anger. My survival instincts, long dormant, buried under years of accommodation and peacekeeping, roared to ferocious life. He wants a war, a cold voice in my head thought. He has no idea what I'm capable of when pushed this far. I immediately called Natalie. Not my friend, the financial advisor, Natalie, but Natalie Foster. The woman I knew deep down was much more than that. The woman whose sharp intelligence I valued above almost anyone else's. We met at our usual spot, the little cafe on South Congress, but the air between us was different, Charit. I didn't cry this time. My voice was low, steady, almost detached as I laid it all out. The lipstick, the systematic financial discrepancies, with printed-out evidence I'd started collecting, the social media photos of Sophia Miller-Jackson's gaslighting, his increasing reliance on this shadowy Patrick, and finally, the damning lawyer's card. I slid it across the table to her. When I finished, Natalie took a long, slow sip of her iced tea, her eyes, usually sparkling with humor, now narrowed with a fierce, protective glint. She took a deep breath. "Okay, Claire," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial level that nonetheless radiated confidence. "First things first. I haven't been entirely honest with you about my job, not fully. I'm not just a financial advisor. That's a side hustle, a passion. My main gig, my career for the last decade, I'm a senior paralegal at Parker and Associates, the top family law division." I stared at her, stunned into silence, the world tilting slightly on its axis. "You work for Ethan Parker. The Ethan Parker whose card this is." I tapped the card on the table, my mind reeling. Ethan Parker was a legend in Austin family law circles, known for being incredibly sharp, strategically brilliant, and fiercely, almost terrifyingly protective of his clients. He was the legal equivalent of a heat-seeking missile. Natalie nodded, a grim little smile playing on her lips. For 10 years side by side with Ethan. And yes, that's his card. And Ethan Parker is exactly who you need to see, Claire. Now. Jackson's playing dirty, very dirty. He's going to try and blindside you, leave you with nothing but dust. We need to play smarter. Much, much smarter. And we need to move fast. That afternoon, Natalie made a call from the cafe's quiet back patio. The next day, after a sleepless night filled with a strange mixture of terror and burgeoning resolve, I was sitting in Ethan Parker's impeccably organized minimalist downtown office, the panoramic view of the Austin skyline, a glittering, indifferent backdrop to the implosion of my life. He was younger than I expected, probably early 40s, with kind, surprisingly empathetic eyes, but an undeniable aura of razor-sharp intellect that was immediately apparent. He listened intently without interruption as I recounted my story, referring to the meticulous, color-coded notes and dated evidence I'd started keeping in a locked file. Bank statements, credit card bills, I'd managed to intercept printouts of social media timelines of Jackson's absences. Natalie sat beside me, a silent, supportive presence. Ethan asked pointed, insightful questions, his gaze never wavering his mind, clearly cataloging every detail. For the first time in months, possibly years, I felt a flicker of hope, a nascent sense of agency, a feeling that I wasn't entirely alone in this terrifying storm. "He thinks you're a pushover," Claire, Ethan said, finally, his tone serious but not unkind, leaning back in his leather chair. "He thinks you'll crumble at the first sign of pressure. He's counting on your inherent decency, your desire to avoid conflict. We're going to use that. His arrogance, his underestimation of you will be his undoing." My internal transformation was swift and total. The quiet, accommodating, often overlooked third-grade teacher began to morph into a meticulous, calculating strategist. I became a student of Jackson's routines, his habits, his increasing carelessness, born of supreme overconfidence. With Ethan and Natalie guiding me every step of the way, I started to gather more concrete evidence. Copies of financial statements he'd carelessly left on his home office desk, discreet photos of him with Sophia Miller entering and leaving a boutique hotel near the Domain. Taken by a private investigator, Natalie recommended a grizzled, surprisingly gentle man named Sal. We even had a small, almost invisible, state-of-the-art security camera disguised as a smoke detector professionally and discreetly installed in our dining room ceiling, the very place I sensed, with a chilling certainty, he would eventually choose for his ambush. The stakes were no longer just my heart, my dignity. They were my home, my financial security, my entire future. I was no longer just waiting for the storm to hit. I was meticulously, secretly preparing to redirect the hurricane right back at him. The little red light on the smoke detector camera blinked innocently from its perch on the dining room ceiling, a silent, patient observer. I knew he was planning something big and ugly and designed to shatter me, and I, against all odds, was ready. Little did he know my plan was already in motion, a complex, multi-layered counteroffensive he would never, ever see coming. The quiet woman was about to make some serious, life-altering noise. The true earth-shattering revelation wasn't a hidden secret I stumbled upon in a dusty attic or a clandestine file I managed to hack. No, the real truth bomb was the unveiling of a meticulously constructed, legally fortified counter-reality, one I had built brick by painful brick in the deepening shadows of Jackson's escalating deceit and contempt. While he was callously, arrogantly plotting my financial and emotional demise, I, with the expert guidance of Ethan and Natalie, was orchestrating his. The most potent truth bomb of all was the sheer depth of my preparation, the astonishing extent to which he had fatally, irretrievably underestimated the quiet, observant woman he shared his bed with, the woman he had dismissed as little more than a piece of household furnishing. In the tense, emotionally fraught weeks following my initial consultation with Ethan Parker, my life took on a surreal, almost cinematic dual quality. Outwardly, to Jackson and the world, I was still Claire Harris, the slightly distracted, perhaps a little sad and withdrawn, but still dutifully functioning third-grade teacher. I went to work, graded papers, planned lessons, smiled vaguely. Inwardly, however, I was a general immersed in covert operations, poring over maps and strategies, preparing for a war I hadn't started, but was utterly determined to win. Ethan and Natalie were my highly skilled, deeply committed war room counsel. Jackson's an archetype Claire Ethan had mused during one of our late-night strategy sessions in his surprisingly calm downtown office, the glittering Austin skyline a silent witness. He's an arrogant, narcissistic CFO with a younger mistress, a burgeoning God complex, and a sudden shady, legal eagle golf buddy who probably got his law degree from a Cracker Jack box. He's going to try and do this on the cheap, fast and dirty. He'll think you're too emotional, too naive, too financially illiterate to question anything he shoves in front of you, especially if he delivers the blow late at night, aiming for maximum shock and awe, hoping you'll sign anything just to make the pain stop. Ethan's words were blunt, but they resonated with a chilling accuracy. Natalie Ever, the pragmatist. Her mind, a steel trap for details, added her pen, tapping a yellow legal pad, guys like this. Patrick, these unlicensed fixers and corner cutters, they almost invariably make mistakes. Big, stupid, legally actionable ones. They use outdated legal templates they find on the internet. They get crucial legal terminology wrong. They don't understand proper procedure for notarization or filing. That's where we'll find our leverage. Jackson's relying on brute force. We'll use precision and the law. Our plan was audacious, bordering on the theatrical, but as Ethan pointed out, sometimes you had to fight fire with fire, especially when your opponent was armed with a flamethrower of deceit. We wouldn't just defend against his attack, we would preempt it, turn his own ambush into a trap for him. We drafted our own set of documents, not divorce papers, not initially. What we prepared was a comprehensive, ironclad post-marital property and settlement agreement. This document, artfully and painstakingly prepared by Ethan's top legal team with Natalie's eagle eye, scrutinizing every clause, every comma, was a masterpiece of legal jujitsu. It stipulated in clear, unambiguous language the immediate transfer of all jointly held major assets, our beautiful suburban house and all its contents, 50% of his vested corporate pension, and a significant, carefully calculated portion of his considerable stock options and other investments, directly and irrevocably to me. But the real masterstroke, the clause that Ethan called the kicker, was the inclusion of a detailed sworn notarized statement seamlessly embedded within the agreement itself. The statement, written in the first person as if by Jackson, detailed his prolonged infidelity with one Ms. Sophia Miller by name, with specific dates and locations gleaned from Sal the PI's discreet surveillance reports, and crucially, an unambiguous admission of his deliberate intent to defraud me by using improperly prepared, fraudulent divorce documents drafted by an unlicensed individual, Mr. Patrick Donovan, also named with his supposed contact details, thereby attempting to criminally subvert the community property laws of the state of Texas and leave me penniless. It was in essence a signed confession. The primary challenge, of course, was the switch. How could we possibly get Jackson, the cunning CFO, to sign our meticulously crafted papers, believing them to be his shoddy, fraudulent ones? He'll have a stack of papers, probably spiral-bound or secured with ACO fasteners, the kind they use for internal reports at big firms. Ethan strategized, steepling his fingers. We need an identical-looking stack. Same paperweight, same specific shade of off-white legal paper, similar page count bound in precisely the same way. The devil is in these details. Natalie, with her encyclopedic knowledge of legal stationery and her network of contacts, took on that seemingly impossible task. She managed to source the exact type of 24-pound bond paper and the specific dark blue plastic spiral binding that Jackson's firm, and therefore likely his buddy Patrick, would use for such documents. She even found a discreet after-hours print shop in a neighboring town run by a cousin of a former client Ethan had helped pro bono, willing to replicate the look and feel based on generic legal templates we provided, ensuring the page numbering and signature blocks looked authentic at a quick glance. The content, of course, was pure, unadulterated dynamite, waiting for a spark. We rehearsed the potential scenarios, the timing, my reactions. My role was to appear devastated, confused, overwhelmed. Emotions that wouldn't be hard to feign as they were lurking just beneath the surface anyway. The trigger event, Jackson contemptuously throwing his stack of papers onto our dining room table, unfolded almost exactly as Ethan had predicted, a macabre play following a well-rehearsed script. It was just after midnight on a Thursday. He'd come home late, his clothes reeking of stale whiskey, cigar smoke, and an artificial, overpowering bravado. His eyes were cold, his face set in a mask of grim satisfaction. His voice was cold, cutting as he delivered his heartless ultimatum. "Sign them, Claire? Right now. You get nothing. You hear me? Absolutely nothing." He tossed a thick, cheaply spiral-bound document onto the polished mahogany surface of our dining room table. It looked amateurish, even to my untrained eye, the font slightly off-kilter, the spacing a little too generous, as if Patrick had struggled with the formatting. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, terrified bird trapped in a cage of my own making. This was it, showtime. The culmination of weeks of fear planning and a desperate clawing hope. I need a glass of water. I stammered, my voice deliberately quavering, feigning a level of shock and distress that felt terrifyingly real. My hand went to my throat, a gesture of helplessness I'd practiced. My mouth is so dry, I can't think. Jackson scoffed a sneer, twisting his lips. Fine, whatever, but be quick about it. I want this done tonight. No delays, no arguments. He remained at the table, impatiently drumming his fingers on the mahogany, already gloating over his perceived swift and total victory. He clearly relished my apparent distress. This was my tiny, perilous window of opportunity. My pre-prepared, identical-looking stack of documents, our documents, was hidden in the antique mahogany sideboard against the dining room wall just a few feet away, concealed beneath a neatly folded stack of linen napkins I placed there earlier. As I walked unsteadily towards the kitchen pass-through to get the water, my back to him, I veered slightly, almost imperceptibly towards the sideboard. My hand trembling but swift, guided by adrenaline and countless mental rehearsals, slid under the napkins, grasped our document, and in the same fluid motion, I palmed the small, slimline digital voice recorder I'd also placed there, already switched on and recording. When I turned back from the kitchen, a glass of water clutched in my shaking hand, his shoddy document was still on the table, but the one I now held partially concealed by the water glass, and my trembling body was mine. He was so utterly consumed by his own impending monologue, his cruel, self-serving recitation of my supposed failings as a wife, his justifications for his affair, which he didn't yet know I knew about in such detail, and his imminent glorious freedom, that he didn't notice the almost imperceptible swap. As I reached the table, I accidentally knocked his stack slightly askew with my elbow while placing the water glass down with a clatter. "Oh, I'm so sorry," I mumbled, flustered. Then, as I straightened them, my hand moving swiftly, I replaced his stack with mine. My hands were clammy. My breath caught painfully in my throat, but my face, I prayed, reflected only the fear, confusion, and devastation he so clearly expected and desired to see. Just sign Claire. At the bottom of every page where it's marked, and the main signature page at the very end, he barked, pointing with a dismissive, impatient finger, not even bothering to glance down at the papers himself. Why would he? He'd orchestrated this. My internal monologue was a chaotic, roaring symphony of terror and triumph. He sees me as nothing, less than nothing, an obstacle to be removed, a disposable wife. He has no idea. He has absolutely no idea the hours, the tears, the sheer, gut-wrenching terror and white-knuckled resolve that have gone into this single terrifying moment. He thinks he's signing my surrender, my annihilation. He's actually signing his own. Every stroke of this pen is for every dismissal, every act of contempt, every lie. I picked up the cheap ballpoint pen he'd slammed down on the table. My signature, usually a flowing, confident script, was tight, controlled, almost spidery. Page after page, I signed where the little yellow "sign here" stickies Natalie had strategically placed were located. Each stroke of the pen was a small, silent act of rebellion, a reclaiming of my power, my future, my very identity. He watched me, a smug, predatory glint in his eyes, leaning back in his chair like a king on his throne. He thought he was witnessing my complete and utter devastation. He was, in fact, witnessing his own meticulously planned, self-inflicted downfall. When I signed the final page, the one with the elaborate notary block Ethan had advised was absolutely crucial for the sworn statement component to be ironclad. I pushed the now signed stack back towards him. My hand was surprisingly steady. "There," I said, my voice barely a whisper laced with faux resignation. "It's done." He snatched them up, a triumphant wolfish smirk spreading across his handsome face. "Good girl, knew you'd see sense. Now get out of my sight. I'll have my lawyer file these first thing in the morning." He didn't even glance at what he was holding. Why would he? He was Jackson Harris, invincible CFO, master of his universe. King of the deal. He'd won, cleanly, decisively. Or so he thought. The truth bomb hadn't just been planted. The fuse was lit, and the countdown had irrevocably begun. The oppressive quiet of the house after he stormed off to the guest room, his new preferred sleeping quarters, a room that now felt miles away, was deafening, broken only by the frantic, percussive thumping of my own heart, a wild, chaotic drumbeat of sheer terror mixed with a dizzying, exhilarating, almost unbelievable triumph. The first faint gray light of dawn was still hours away, but for me, Clare Evans, a new uncertain but undeniably hopeful day had already finally begun. The following morning dawned crisp and deceptively clear, a beautiful, bright Austin day, the kind where the sky is a vast, benevolent blue, utterly at odds with the Category 5 hurricane brewing inside the four walls of our suburban home. I was in the kitchen, a mug of chamomile tea, my third that morning, warming my chilled hands when Jackson finally emerged from the guest room around 9 a.m. He looked rumpled from sleep but unbearably smug, the predatory air of a conqueror still clinging to him like cheap cologne. He poured himself a large black coffee, not even gracing me with a glance, then sauntered with a proprietary air into the dining room, presumably to admire his handiwork from the night before, the documents that were supposed to be his ticket to freedom and my swift, brutal eviction from his life, leaving me with nothing. The dining room camera, my silent, crucial witness, was still recording. I heard the distinct clatter of his heavy ceramic coffee cup hitting the polished mahogany table. Then a choked, guttural sound like someone had punched him hard in the stomach, followed by a furious, incredulous, almost strangled, "What the actual hell is this?" He stormed back into the kitchen, his face a mask of purple-tinged rage, his eyes bulging, the thick stack of papers clutched in his hand shaking so violently that a few pages threatened to escape their spiral binding. "What is this garbage, Claire? What kind of sick, twisted joke are you playing? These aren't the papers. These aren't my papers." And that's when Natalie Foster, impeccably dressed in a sharp navy pantsuit, walked in through the unlocked back door as prearranged, carrying a sleek leather briefcase. She looked cool, professional, utterly composed, and completely unfazed by Jackson's apoplectic fury. "Good morning, Jackson," she said calmly, her voice even and steady as she placed her briefcase on the granite kitchen island. "It's no joke, I assure you. It's a legally binding, fully executed post-marital property and settlement agreement that you signed under absolutely no duress shortly after midnight last night. Witnessed in effect by a recording device." Jackson stared at her, then at me, his face a grotesque contortion of disbelief and dawning panic. "Foster, what in God's name are you doing here? This is a private matter, and what are you talking about? I signed divorce papers. Papers that leave her," he jabbed a trembling accusatory finger at me, "with absolutely nothing. As she deserves." "Actually, Jackson," I said, my voice surprisingly steady, clear, and resonant in the sudden silence fueled by adrenaline and months of suppressed indignation, "you signed papers that irrevocably transfer our primary marital residence and all its contents to me. You also signed over 50% of your vested corporate pension and a significant pre-calculated portion of your considerable stock options and other joint investments. Furthermore, and perhaps most importantly, you also signed a detailed sworn affidavit under penalty of perjury admitting to a prolonged clandestine affair with one Ms. Sophia Miller of Sophia's company, if known or city, and to actively conspiring with a Mr. Patrick Donovan to commit egregious financial fraud against me by attempting to use illicitly prepared, non-compliant legal documents to deny me my legal and rightful share of our marital assets under Texas community property law. I recited the key points almost verbatim from memory, the words tasting like vindication. Jackson's jaw literally dropped. His mouth opened and closed silently like a fish gasping for air. His face, moments before flushed with explosive anger, began to drain of all color, leaving it a pasty, sickly gray. That's impossible. That's insane. Those aren't the papers I gave you. You switched them. You tricked me. His voice rose to a hysterical shriek. Indeed we did, Natalie interjected smoothly, her voice cutting through his panic like a scalpel. A classic bait and switch. And we have irrefutable proof of the entire exchange, Jackson. Claire. I nodded towards the dining room, a small, almost regretful smile touching my lips. The small, discreet security camera, Jackson, the one ingeniously disguised as a smoke detector mounted on the ceiling. It recorded everything. Your grand entrance, your cruel threats, your vile pronouncements, my Oscar-worthy distress, and you quite clearly handing me your stack of amateurish papers. Then after the subtle swap, it recorded me signing the papers you now hold under your watchful, gloating gaze. Your buddy Patrick, by the way, really should have advised you about the rules of evidence and discovery in civil litigation, though I strongly doubt he's actually qualified to advise on much of anything beyond perhaps a golf swing. Natalie continued, her voice crisp and authoritative. My name for the record is Natalie Foster Jackson, and while Claire and I are indeed very good friends, my primary professional capacity here this morning is as senior paralegal for Parker and Associates, specifically in the Family Law Division. Mr. Ethan Parker, whose card you so carelessly left for Claire to find, is my boss and has been for the past decade. Jackson looked like he'd been poleaxed, struck by lightning. He stumbled back a step, his eyes wide with dawning, uncomprehending horror clutching his chest. Parker. But his card. I thought she was going to him for a consultation. It was a plant, Jackson. I said softly, the quietest words often landing with the most force. A calculated bit of misdirection to see if you'd take the bait and reveal your intentions. You did. Spectacularly. He started to bluster, a cornered animal lashing out. This is outrageous. This is illegal. I'll sue. I'll destroy you both. You'll never get away with this. I don't think so, Jackson, Natalie said coolly, opening her briefcase. From it, she produced a slim, professionally bound document, a stark contrast to the one Jackson was still clutching. These, Jackson, are legitimate standard petition for divorce papers, along with a proposed agreed final decree of divorce, drafted by Ethan Parker himself. They offer you a fair, equitable, and legally sound settlement based strictly on Texas community property law. Frankly, it's significantly more generous than what you intended for Claire. It gives you your precious Portia, your personal effects, your separate property accounts if you can prove their separate nature, and the other half of your pension that you're legally entitled to. It's clean, it's by the book, and it's your only dignified way out of this monumental mess you've created for yourself without facing serious career-ending and potentially criminal consequences. Just then, as if on cue from a divine karmic stage manager, the doorbell rang its cheerful, incongruous chimes. I opened it to find Margaret Harris standing on the porch, a large foil-covered casserole dish in her perfectly manicured hands, a strained but superior smile plastered on her face. Jackson mentioned you two were having a rather difficult discussion last night, dear. She began, her usual patronizing tone firmly in place, clearly ready to play mediator and ensure her son's interests were protected. I just thought I'd bring over some of my famous tuna noodle comfort food and perhaps help you both see reason. Her voice trailed off as she stepped inside and took in the highly charged, tableau-like scene Jackson pale trembling, looking utterly broken. Me composed, resolute, and Natalie looking every inch the formidable legal professional she was. The papers Jackson had signed, our papers, were still splayed on the island where he'd thrown them. Margaret's gaze, sharp and assessing, fell upon them. Her eyes narrowed as she picked up the top sheet of the document Jackson had signed, the one containing the detailed sworn statement detailing his affair with Sophia Miller and his fraudulent intentions. Her carefully constructed imperious composure cracked, then visibly crumbled. "Jackson, what in God's name is the meaning of this Sophia Miller, that ambitious young woman from your office, the one you said was a rising star we need to cultivate, and fraud?" Her voice was a horrified whisper. Jackson visibly withered under his mother's shocked, accusing gaze. The fight, the bluster seemed to drain out of him completely, leaving behind a deflated, pathetic shell. Ethan Parker's calm, authoritative voice then came through Natalie's phone, which she'd discreetly placed on speaker mode on the island. "Mr. Ethan Parker here. I trust Ms. Foster has explained the current situation. You have precisely two options. Option 1, you can sign the fair and equitable divorce agreement Ms. Foster has just presented to you. It's a clean break. Option 2, we can and will immediately proceed with filing a civil suit against you for fraud, seeking punitive damages. We will also be ethically bound to submit the comprehensive evidence of your affair, your admitted financial misconduct, and your conspiracy with Mr. Patrick Donovan, who, by the way, our investigators have confirmed is not a licensed attorney in the state of Texas, and will therefore be immediately reported to the state bar for the unauthorized practice of law, a serious offense to your company's board of directors and its internal ethics committee. That high-definition security footage from your dining room, Mr. Harris, is quite compelling, as is your signed confession. I imagine your shareholders and the SEC would be very interested in a CFO who engages in such deceitful, potentially criminal behavior. You have 24 hours to decide, Mr. Harris, but I'd strongly advise you sign today. Your reputation, your career, your financial future, and quite possibly your freedom, it's all on the line." The silence in the kitchen was thick enough to cut with a knife heavy with unspoken recriminations and shattered illusions. Margaret looked from the damning papers to her son, her face a tragic mask of disbelief, shame, and dawning horror. For the first time, I felt a fleeting pang of something akin to pity for her. Jackson stared at the legitimate divorce papers Natalie held out, his shoulders slumped in utter abject defeat. The fight was gone, extinguished, replaced by a desperate, panicked, and finally complete understanding of his catastrophic predicament. He was checkmated, the pen Jackson Natalie offered gently holding out a simple, inexpensive Bic pen, a stark contrast to the gold-plated fountain pens he usually favored. Slowly, his hand shaking so violently he could barely grasp it, Jackson Harris, the arrogant CFO, the master manipulator, the man who thought he could destroy me and walk away scot-free, took the pen. He didn't look at me. He didn't look at his mother, who was now quietly weeping into a linen handkerchief. He just stared at the signature line on Ethan Parker's cleanly drafted divorce decree. Then, with a strangled, shuddering sigh that sounded like the last rattling breath of his dying arrogance, he signed. My moment of triumph wasn't loud or explosive. It was a quiet, profound, internal wave of immense relief, the solid, satisfying click of a heavy iron door closing decisively on a painful, toxic chapter of my life, and another one brighter, lighter, and more hopeful creaking open. Justice, I realized in that moment, wasn't always about shouting from the rooftops. Sometimes it was just the soft, decisive rustle of papers signed under the undeniable, inescapable weight of truth. Karma didn't just come for him, it brought an entire army of receipts. The ink was barely dry on the legitimate divorce papers, the Bic pen still lying forlornly on the granite countertop, when the carefully constructed glittering world of Jackson Harris began to crumble with astonishing, almost cinematic speed. He left the house within the hour, a single expensive leather suitcase, hastily, haphazardly packed by me, as he stood by, dazed and mute, his face a gray slack mask of utter defeat and stunned disbelief. He didn't say a single word to me, nor to his mother, who stood by the doorway, her earlier composure shattered beyond repair, looking older, smaller, and more vulnerable than I had ever seen her. Her carefully applied makeup was streaked with tears, her silver helmet of hair slightly askew. The casserole dish lay abandoned on the hall table, its contents growing cold. Once he was gone, the sound of his Porsche roaring away down the street, a final, fading growl of defiance. Natalie, Ethan still patiently on speakerphone, his voice a calm, reassuring presence in the chaotic aftermath, and I went over the signed documents one last meticulous time. The quiet hum of the oversized Sub-Zero refrigerator was the loudest sound in the suddenly cavernous room. "It's done, Claire," Ethan said finally, his voice tinged with a weary satisfaction. He had absolutely no choice. "You were magnificent, truly. One for the books." Natalie reached across the island and squeezed my arm, her eyes shining with a mixture of pride and relief. "You did it, Claire. You really, really did it. You faced the dragon and you won." A wave of profound exhaustion washed over me so potent I had to sit down heavily on a kitchen stool, my legs suddenly feeling like overcooked pasta. It wasn't just the acute stress of the morning's confrontation, but the accumulated bone-deep weight of months of clandestine planning, of gnawing fear, of holding my breath, of living a terrifying double life. I felt like I could sleep for a week, a year even. The very first thing I did after Natalie and Ethan virtually left after giving Natalie a long, tearful hug was call a 24-hour locksmith. Hearing the sharp, definitive click of the new high-security tumblers engaging in the locks on all the doors was a deeply, primally satisfying sound, a tangible, audible severing of the final tie. My house was mine. My call to Margaret later that day was brief, civil, and to the point. I didn't embellish or gloat. There was no need. The facts spoke for themselves with brutal eloquence. I simply stated that Jackson had been unfaithful for a significant period, had attempted to defraud me of my legal share of our marital assets, and that I had taken the necessary legal steps to protect myself and secure my future. Her response was a confused, disjointed murmur of apologies, disbelief, and thinly veiled accusations that I must have somehow provoked him, punctuated by pathetic, self-pitying sighs. I don't understand how my Jackson, my sensitive, brilliant boy could... I didn't try to make her understand. It wasn't my burden to carry anymore. The complex, often strained dynamics with her were irrevocably altered. The polite, brittle fiction of our mother-daughter-in-law relationship was well and truly over. I felt a surprising sense of release. Jackson predictably, once the initial shock wore off, and he was presumably ensconced in some temporary accommodation, tried to salvage the unsalvageable situation through a desperate flurry of bluster and emotional manipulation. He left a string of increasingly unhinged voicemails on my now disconnected old number. Ethan had insisted I get a new one. Immediately, first came the threats of lawsuits and accusations of extortion, which Ethan had already thoroughly neutralized with the signed confession and video evidence. Then came the pathetic pleas for reconsideration. "Claire, baby, we can work this out. Please don't throw 12 years away over a misunderstanding." I was stressed. I wasn't thinking clearly. And finally, the truly desperate, sniveling attempts at emotional blackmail. "You're destroying my life, my career, everything I've worked for. How can you be so cruel? Don't you have a heart?" I didn't pick up. I didn't even listen to them beyond the first few seconds. All communication, as Ethan had firmly instructed, was routed exclusively through his office. My boundaries, once as porous and undefined as a sieve, were now forged of reinforced steel. Sophia Miller, upon hearing the rapidly spreading whispers and then shouts of Jackson's spectacular personal and professional implosion news, especially bad news, travels at warp speed in the incestuous corporate corridors of Austin, particularly when a high-profile CFO is involved in a scandal, reportedly distanced herself with the speed and agility of a startled gazelle spotting a lion. Her ambition, it seemed, did not extend to propping up a rapidly falling disgraced star. She was by all accounts already scouting for her next high-powered benefactor. Patrick, the hapless golf buddy and aspiring legal eagle, received a very alarming, very official certified letter from Ethan Parker's office, outlining his transgressions, followed swiftly by a formal, deeply serious inquiry from the disciplinary committee of the State Bar of Texas regarding the unauthorized practice of law. His short-lived, ignominious career dispensing cheap and dirty legal favors was well and truly numbered. The problem solver had become the problem. Support blessedly came from some unexpected and heartwarming quarters. My sweet elderly next-door neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, a woman whose prize-winning roses were the envy of the neighborhood, caught me in the driveway a few days later as I was struggling with an overflowing recycling bin. "Dear," she said, her kind blue eyes crinkling at the corners as she patted my arm gently, "I don't mean to pry, child, but I'm truly glad that man is gone. The late hours, the different fancy cars pulling up at all odd times of night. You have a good heart, Claire. You deserve better. Much better." Her simple, heartfelt words, offered with such genuine kindness, meant more to her than she could possibly know a small balm on a raw wound. My colleagues at Northwood Elementary, when I eventually shared a heavily sanitized, carefully curated version of events, focusing on an amicable but necessary split, but one that was ultimately empowering for me, rallied around me with quiet understanding, unwavering support, and an endless supply of comforting casseroles, the supportive, non-judgmental kind. Natalie, of course, was my rock, my constant, a seemingly endless source of strength, practical advice, and wickedly inappropriate gallows humor that kept me sane through the darkest hours. We drank a lot of wine and ate a lot of takeout pizza in those first few weeks. The short-term changes in my life were stark, almost brutal. The house, our beautiful home, felt simultaneously vast and eerily empty, yet paradoxically lighter, as if a heavy, oppressive, suffocating atmosphere had finally blessedly lifted. I began to reclaim the space slowly, tentatively. I moved furniture, packed away every last trace of Jackson's belongings, into boxes which Ethan's office arranged to have collected by a discreet moving service, and slowly, tentatively, allowed myself to breathe deeply again, to inhale air that didn't taste of deceit and anxiety. The emotional processing was complex, a tangled mess of conflicting feelings. There was grief, yes, a profound aching grief for the marriage I thought I had, for the man I once loved, or at least believed I did, for the future we were supposed to share. But intricately, powerfully intertwined with the grief was an undeniable, burgeoning, exhilarating sense of liberation. The quiet woman had found her voice not in shouting or hysterics, but in strategic silence, meticulous planning, and decisive, courageous action. The victory wasn't just in the legal papers and the assets secured. It was in the profound, deeply personal reclaiming of my own narrative, my own agency, my own intrinsic worth. I had faced the monster under the bed, the architect of my anxieties, and discovered he was just a common bully, easily disarmed by unwavering truth and a well-executed, legally sound plan. Justice wasn't just served, it was a 5-course meal, and I was finally allowing myself to savor it. 2 years. 2 years can feel like an eternity, a lifetime compressed into a whirlwind of change, or it can pass in the blink of an eye, a mere breath in the grand sweep of existence, depending entirely on what those years hold. For me, Clare Evans, a name I now wore with a quiet, comfortable pride, those 2 years were a period of profound, almost alchemical transformation, a quiet, steady, deeply personal renaissance. The Clare who had tremblingly, tearfully signed those counter documents, her heart a wild drum against her ribs, was a distant, almost unrecognizable memory, a sepia-toned photograph from a previous life. She had been replaced by a woman who stood taller, both literally and figuratively, spoke more clearly and confidently, and whose smile, when it came, reached her eyes without hesitation, radiating a genuine, hard-won warmth. I thrived. I truly, astonishingly, thrived. The promotion to head of elementary curriculum at Northwood Elementary, which had occurred just before the final implosion of my marriage, wasn't just a fancy new title and a slightly bigger office. It became my platform, my purpose. I poured my renewed energy and focus into developing innovative literacy programs, into securing grants for arts education, into mentoring new teachers with a passion and empathy born directly from my own painful experiences of being overlooked and undervalued. I found a deep, resonant, almost spiritual joy in my work that had been overshadowed and stifled for far too long by the suffocating weight of my failing marriage. The school district recognized my contributions with a Leadership in Education award. I even started presenting my curriculum models at regional and then national education conferences, something the old timid Claire would have found terrifyingly public, impossibly daunting. Now I found I rather enjoyed sharing my passion, engaging with fellow educators, feeling like I was part of a larger, meaningful conversation. The house, once a silent, beautifully appointed battleground of passive aggression and unspoken resentments, became my sanctuary, my haven. I redecorated with a vengeance, exorcising the last ghosts of Jackson's minimalist, cold, gray and chrome aesthetic. It was replaced with warm woods, vibrant, jewel-toned textiles, comfortable, overstuffed furniture that I loved, and shelves, so many shelves, overflowing with books, my constant companions. The magnificent, sprawling oak in the backyard, its branches reaching towards the sky like welcoming arms, became my favorite spot for morning coffee, quiet reflection, and evening glasses of wine with Natalie. It was my home in every sense of the word, a place that reflected my soul, not his ambition. I even adopted a scruffy, one-eyed terrier mix from Austin Pets Alive, a little survivor with a crooked tail and an indomitable spirit. I named him Buddy, a true, loyal, joyfully uncomplicated companion whose happy snores were the best lullaby. And what of the antagonists, the architects of my previous misery? Karma, as Ethan Parker had once dryly remarked during one of our early meetings, has an excellent, if sometimes slow, auditing system. It rarely misses a payment. Jackson Harris lost his coveted CFO position almost immediately after the board received Ethan's discreet but damning information packet. The official reason cited in the terse company press release was mutual agreement due to differing strategic visions, a common corporate euphemism for fired for cause, but we don't want a messy lawsuit. The carefully chosen vague wording was enough to avoid a public spectacle, but the whispers, then roars in Austin's tight-knit, gossipy financial community were deafening. His carefully cultivated reputation was in tatters, shredded beyond repair. The last I heard through a mutual acquaintance Natalie still occasionally encountered at industry events was that he was working a significantly lower-level, lower-paid consultancy job for a much smaller, less prestigious firm out of state, somewhere in the Midwest, I think. He was reportedly living in a cramped, soulless apartment complex, his once legendary arrogance replaced by a bitter, corrosive resentment towards the world, and especially towards me. The vintage Porsche, his prized phallic symbol, I learned through the grapevine, had been sold at a significant loss to cover mounting legal fees and outstanding personal debts. He'd tried to contest parts of the signed agreement, of course, but Ethan had shut that down swiftly and decisively. Sophia Miller, with her characteristic ruthless expediency and finely honed survival instincts, had by all accounts landed firmly on her feet at another large corporation in another city, leaving Jackson and the smoldering wreckage of his career far behind without a backward glance. Her ambition was her unwavering compass, and it rarely, if ever, pointed backwards or towards loyalty. Our paths thankfully never crossed again, and for that I was profoundly grateful. I wished her no specific ill, only that she might one day learn that true success isn't built on the ruins of other people's lives. Patrick Donovan Jackson's unlicensed golf buddy and aspiring legal eagle faced the full, unmitigated censure of the State Bar of Texas. He was heavily fined, publicly reprimanded, and permanently barred from offering any services that could remotely be construed as legal advice in the state. His short-lived, ignominious reputation as a fixer was obliterated, his name becoming a cautionary tale in local legal circles. Margaret Harris and I had no contact. After a few initial guilt-laden, tearful attempts on her part to understand what went wrong, which sounded suspiciously and tiresomely like attempts to make me feel responsible for Jackson's spectacular downfall and subsequent misery, I had politely but firmly, with Natalie's coaching, closed that door. I heard through a distant family connection that she was supporting Jackson financially. To some extent, her misguided maternal devotion still stubbornly intact, though undoubtedly strained by his dramatically diminished circumstances and his perpetual grating bitterness. She had, in essence, lost her golden boy, or at least the glittering illusion of him. My own family dynamics, the ones rooted in my childhood, didn't magically resolve overnight, but my perspective on them and my role within them shifted profoundly. I no longer sought validation where it wasn't freely, willingly given. I detached with love. My relationship with my sister Deirdre even improved slightly surprisingly. After the dust settled, she'd called me and for the first time sounded genuinely impressed, almost awed. "Wow, Claire," she'd said. "I never knew you had that in you. You're kind of a badass." It wasn't exactly a heartfelt apology for years of overshadowing me, but it was a start. Natalie remained my closest confidant, my chosen sister, our bond forged even stronger in the crucible of my divorce. Ethan Parker became a respected acquaintance, a friendly face I'd occasionally bump into at Austin fundraisers or art openings, always greeting me with a warm, genuine smile and a subtle, knowing nod. He once told me my case was one of his most satisfying, not for the legal complexity, but for the human outcome. I found new friendships, genuine reciprocal connections with people who appreciated my quiet intelligence, my dry wit, and my newfound hard-won confidence. I even started dating again cautiously at first, like testing the waters of a new ocean, but with a much clearer, non-negotiable understanding of what I wanted, needed, and absolutely deserved in a partner. There was no rush. My peace, my hard-won serenity was paramount. I was whole on my own. Reflecting on the tumultuous journey, the lessons learned were etched onto my soul, crystal clear and indelible. The betrayal, as devastating and soul-crushing as it had inadvertently been a crucible forging a strength, a resilience, a fierceness I never knew I possessed. It taught me the profound, non-negotiable importance of trusting my intuition, that quiet, persistent inner voice I had silenced and ignored for far too long. It showed me in the most dramatic fashion possible that meticulous preparation, unwavering truth, and a refusal to be intimidated are formidable, almost unbeatable weapons against deceit, arrogance, and bullying. Most importantly, it taught me to understand, to cherish, and to fiercely protect my own intrinsic worth. Jackson's gross underestimation of me wasn't a reflection of my actual value. It was a fatal, catastrophic miscalculation on his part, born of his own blinding hubris and misogyny. The quiet woman had not only survived the storm, she had learned to harness its power and had rewritten her entire story on her own damn terms. And it was a bestseller. Now I want to ask you, my dear reader, my fellow traveler, have you ever had to find a hidden strength within yourself, a courage you didn't know you possessed until dire circumstances brutally demanded it? What's the biggest, most impactful lesson a betrayal, whether big or small, has taught you about yourself, about others, or about the intricate dance of life? And perhaps, most importantly, who is your Natalie, that unwavering friend, that steadfast rock, that chosen family member who has your back? No questions asked, no matter what chaos life decides to throw your way. Celebrate them. Cherish them. If this story resonated with you on any level, if you found a piece of your own experience, your own quiet battles reflected in mine, please hit that like button. Subscribe for more stories of resilience, reclamation, and truth ultimately prevailing. And please share it with someone who might need to hear that they are not alone, that their quiet strength is a superpower, and that hope and justice can be found in the most unexpected corners of their own spirit. Comment below with your own moments of standing up for yourself, lessons learned from navigating difficult relationships, or simply to share your support. Let's build a thriving, supportive community of survivors and thrivers right here, right now. Your story matters.